We're glad to have Brother with us today. He got his doctorate in economics from Oxford before he became a Dominican, and then spent a postdoc year at Oxford while he organized a series of lectures on the history of economic crises. I think I'm getting some feedback from his microphone, maybe. And then he joined the Dominicans after that. I know, Brother, we overlapped for a few years in Washington playing soccer together. Not only does he have a beautiful Australian accent, he also has quite a good foot. But we're pleased to have him with us today to give this lecture that will draw together a whole bunch of worlds. Humanities, theology, economics, business, and so forth. And so thank you, Brother, for coming, and we're glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Father Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for the invitation to come to speak. I must say I've never seen my photo on a poster so large before. And so I'm really quite honored. I seem to have a celebrity status for a day, so it's wonderful to be here. This talk is indeed about the importance of personal prayer to the economic and social renewal of the world. And to do this, I'm going to begin by contrasting two approaches to the problem of financial crises. The first is the way that economists typically analyze financial crises using theory and models. And the second way is the way that the church responds to financial crises. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the writings of Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius XI, who both lived during times of great economic upheaval at the end of the 19th century in the case of Pope Leo, and the beginning of the 20th century in the case of Pope Pius XI. The objective of this talk is not to show up or supplant economics, but to show that the Pope's emphasis on spiritual rather than economic, institutional, or political forms of reform was not foolish or unreasonable. In fact, I'm going to try to argue why their advice was fundamental, given the truth about the nature of the human person and what constitutes true human happiness. Let's start with the economists. In October of 2008, when I was still a doctoral student at Oxford, a public table discussion was organized by Oxford's Department of Economics, which brought together the best economists of the department to discuss the unfolding financial crisis. The poster advertising the event was not as big as the poster advertising this event, despite the prominence of these speakers, but all the same, the main lecture theatre of the department was filled to capacity to hear our most senior and most informed faculty speak about the crisis. The first speaker distributed a handout which represents how economists analyze, oops, that's not right. The first speaker distributed a handout which represents how economists analyze an event of this kind. The schema, reproduced on this screen, summarizes what he saw as the chain of causes and effects of the financial crisis. According to him, the crisis was caused by two separate phenomena: low interest rates, which increased demand for house mortgages, and a special financial innovation called collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, which effectively enabled banks to increase ad infinitum, or near ad infinitum, the supply of loan funds for mortgages. And together, these factors created an era of cheap money that fueled the preceding housing boom. The key to the financial crisis was the creation of these CDOs, which are financial assets that are created by banks by selling off the mortgages they originate to other financial institutions like insurance companies, pension funds, and hedge funds, so that the banks can liquidate their mortgages and release capital in order to finance more and more mortgages, thereby achieving higher and higher rates of growth and market share. Because CDOs were backed by mortgages, their asset-backed securities, they were rated by ratings agencies such as Standard & Poor's to be of minimal risk, even though the underlying assets upon which they were based, namely housing and stocks, were massively overvalued due to the protracted housing and stock market boom. And this was the sinister catch with these sorts of securities. Their market values were highly sensitive to changes in the values of their underlying assets by design, so that in the event of a housing crash, the market value of these securities was severely reduced. In fact, these securities, which had very complex structures, were so structured that even a minimal fall in the return of its composite assets, say a 5% fall in house prices would be sufficient to wipe out the whole value of the CDO. Alas, the music did eventually stop in the form of a declining housing market here in the United States. The falling house prices had a double effect. First, it eroded the value of the asset-backed securities, and in turn, the CDOs, which many banks worldwide had invested in. And second, it caused many borrowers to default as the real value of their houses fell below the nominal value of their mortgage debts. Defaulting on loans in such a situation where the market value of the house falls below the nominal value of the mortgage debt is, after all, perfectly rational, according to economic theory. Fears about the future of the housing market translated logically into fears about the value of banks, which lent imprudently on houses, and more importantly, which invested in CDOs. And uncertainty about the true value of the bank's balance sheets caused investors, banks, and other financial institutions to stop lending to each other on the wholesale housing markets. Banks that had been particularly aggressive during the housing boom found themselves tightly constrained for liquidity and unable to meet short-term obligations on time, which is the very definite definition of insolvency. The first bank to fall was Northern Rock in the UK in September 2007, which was fully nationalised in the following February of 2008. The spectacular failure of this bank sparked panic among investors about the state of other banks in the UK, US, and Europe, and led to further high-profile failures such as Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and AIG in the US. These additional failures sparked more panic and retreat from the financial markets. The declining equity values in the stock market, combined with uncertainty about the true health of financial institutions, caused a squeeze in liquidity, money, in the economy, a phenomenon popularly referred to as the credit crunch, which simply refers to the difficulty in obtaining credit due to the hoarding of money by risk-averse investors. As money is the lifeblood of the economy, the credit crunch had severe implications for the real economy, forcing central banks worldwide to engage in quantitative easing in order to moderate the sharp slowdown in economic activity, which we indeed, in fact, have been experiencing even until now. Those who have studied economic history know that financial crises are not new. There have been a plethora of speculative booms and busts during history, which have led to painful contractions over time. Some of them you can see on screen. Of course, all of us, despite none of us ever living through it, know of the 1929 crash, I'm sure, which of course was followed by the Great Depression of the 1930s. The recurrence of financial crises throughout history has led several economists to posit that financial crises are a natural feature of capitalist economic life. One economist who has popularized this view of the inevitability of financial crises is Minsky. Minsky's theory, particularly since the last crisis has risen in prominence, as one of the best narrative theories about the pattern of financial crises we have. Indeed, the very point when financial crises begin has been dubbed the Minsky Moment in honor. Minsky argued that there was a pattern to all financial crises. First, they begin with some sort of displacement. This is an event, such as a bad harvest, sort of technological innovation, which creates some abnormal profit opportunity in a particular market sector, such as, for example, a technological innovation like the internet leading to a boom in technology stocks, which, as you know, eventually culminated in the dot-com crash of 2000-2001. The ensuing speculative activity in that particular market then causes the price of the commodity to spiral. To accommodate demand for this commodity and to take advantage of capital gains from investing in the commodity, institutions devise ways of creating new money in order to speculate on the booming commodity, that is, financial innovation. For example, the creation of new securities, debt instruments, is intended to free up capital in order to purchase more and more of the commodity, like our CDOs from before. This process of money creation and market speculation continues in a cycle for some time, sustaining the market boom. At some point, an event occurs which frightens investors, and this may be in the form of a swindle, the discovery of an unscrupulous trader who has falsified his trading activities to steal from investors, or worse, the collapse of a key institution that was part of the speculative market. The swindle or failure then causes financial distress, as investors become suspicious of other companies in the market and swiftly pull out their capital. This leads to a domino effect, which culminates in a widespread panic among investors, and finally to revulsion, an abrupt withdrawal of money from the market, which is what we call the credit crunch. A crash ensues, liquidity becomes constrained, and then an economic downturn occurs. So the current or the recent financial crisis, we can apply this framework to this recent crisis, as you can see here on screen. But to move things along, look at another crisis that was very similar, and is perhaps the most famous financial crisis of all, the Great Crash of 1929. The recent global financial crisis has been likened to that of the US stock market crash in 1929. In fact, the anatomy of these two crises can be shown to be very similar. As before, a displacement occurs in the economy. The Roaring Twenties was a time of incredible economic growth, driven by technological innovations that sparked an explosion in consumer demand for automobiles, radios, and refrigerators. In fact, between 1920 and 1929, the US economy expanded by 40.6%, becoming a world leader in industrial production by the end of the period. In fact, half of the world's industrial output was produced in the United States. The increased market opportunities translated into market booms in housing and stocks. Between 1923 to 1929, common stocks increased in value by 120%, or an annualized rate of 21.8%. A large part of the market euphoria was fueled by banks and investment houses who created innovative financial products in order to expand money supply. These included higher purchase loans to stimulate consumer demand for durable goods and call loans in order to provide liquid credit to brokers to speculate on stock markets. The market boom continued until late in the 1920s, when a rise in the number of bank failures and fears that the US government was going to switch to contractionary monetary supply in order to burst the stock market bubble led to a revulsion from the market on October 29, 1929. On that day, 16.4 million shares were sold by frantic investors in order to avoid massive losses. In 2 days, the stock market shed 25% of its value, and that was just the beginning. The economic effects were quite severe. Share prices, stock markets lost quite a lot of their capital, as you can see from the table. Industrial production seized up, and unemployment increased. The decline in production displaced many men from their jobs, and unemployment increased sharply both in the UK and the US. But as bad as these figures look, they pale in reality, in the reality of the human toll that this crisis caused. Oftentimes, as economists, we could ignore the human experiences behind these events simply because we can't represent it in our sophisticated mathematical models. Because we can't quantify it, it is not really of relevance or something to be captured by our models because it's outside the bounds of impartial scientific economics. The human suffering was real and it was extreme. In the United States, 4.3 million Americans were out of work. Approximately 8 million were homeless. 32,000 businesses went bankrupt, and at least 5,000 banks failed during this time, taking with them the savings of many working households. Shanty towns, known as Hoovervilles, sprang up in many US cities, consisting of many households that were displaced from their homes by bank foreclosures or else driven to it through loss of income due to unemployment. It was in the midst of this meltdown of the economy that Pope Pius XI, who reigned as Pope from 1922 to 1939, issued a number of encyclical letters that mark a very different way of analysing and understanding the nature of the economic crisis. The most famous of these encyclical letters, that is to say, letters by the Pope addressed to Catholics worldwide and men of goodwill in order to instruct and exhort people about a particular matter relating to faith or morals, usually in response to a particular crisis. The most famous of his encyclical letters was his 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, written in the depths of the Great Depression, in which he diagnoses the causes of the Depression as both institutional and moral in nature, particularly the forgetfulness of things eternal and the excessive care for passing things. Quoting from the encyclical, "If human society is to be healed, only a return to Christian life and institutions will heal it. for this alone can provide an effective remedy for that excessive care for passing things that is the origin of all vices. And this alone can draw away men's eyes, fascinated by and wholly fixed on the changing things of the world, and raise them toward heaven. Who would deny that human society is in most urgent need of this cure now? This was not the first time that the Pope made such a radical call in the face of an economic crisis. 2 months after the Depression began with the Great Crash in October 1929, he issued another encyclical called Mens Nostra, in Latin meaning our mind, which was about the promotion of spiritual exercises. Mens Nostra was even more remarkable than Quadragesimo Anno in its singular focus on the need for a spiritual renewal of society as a solution for the economic crisis. For Pius XI, this would be the return by people to a regular practice of spiritual retreats, days or weekends spent solely on prayer and meditation and away from the cares of work and business. To quote, "The utility and the opportuneness of sacred retreats will be readily recognized by anyone who considers, however lightly, the times in which we now live. The most grave disease afflicting our age, and the fruitful source as well of the evils deplored by every well-intentioned man, is that levity and thoughtlessness which sweeps people hither and thither along devious ways. Hence we have the constant and passionate absorption in external things. Hence the insatiable thirst for riches and pleasures, which gradually lessens and extinguishes in the minds of men the desire for more excellent goods, involving them so in outward and fleetwood pursuits that it prevents them from giving thought to eternal trust, the divine laws, and God himself, the origin and ultimate purpose of all things. If then we would cure this sickness from which society so sorely suffers, what healing remedy can we devise more appropriate than to induce such enervated souls, neglected of eternal things, to center their thoughts on the spiritual exercises?" As we shall see in this talk, these encyclicals were 2 of a series of social encyclicals by the popes, stressing the primacy of prayer and spiritual solutions to the economic and social problems of their day. Now, in highlighting this message, again, I don't mean to demean economics. I myself am an economist, and I know that there is much that is useful and relevant in economics to resolving crises, but my intention here is to show why attention to the spiritual dimension that the Pope stress is reasonable given a proper understanding of the nature of the human person and how economics, by virtue of its nature as a secular discipline, is limited in its capacity to appreciate the spiritual dimension of man and account for how it affects his life and the society in which we live. Because if we think about the economic narratives of financial crises I outlined earlier, we can see a certain inadequacy in them. Notice how these crises were described and analyzed in the first part of this talk. Recall the schema that I showed you earlier, which treated the crisis as having its genesis in an era of low interest rates and in the securitization of debt. We might ask of this theory why there were low interest rates in the first place, and why did banks recklessly package their mortgage assets into highly risky debt securities for sale on the capital market? Of course, more economic factors can be added to this story. I'm not trying to set up a straw man, but how satisfying are these factors as truly primary causes of the crises they describe? Likewise, in Minsky's analysis of financial crises, which I like quite a lot, absent is a theory of what sets off the train of events characteristics of an economic crisis in the first place. What causes the displacement, the event that creates a market opportunity that sets in train the destructive process of boom and bust? Neoclassical economics says little about this point, apart from saying that there are exogenous factors that affect it, chance factors that are not captured by theory. Minsky's half answer to this question is that stability is destabilizing, in the sense that prolonged stability leads to complacency in risk management practices and increased attempts to innovate and create increasingly risky profit opportunities in order to outperform the market, like core loans in the Great Depression or CDOs in the current crisis. This introduces a destabilizing impulse to the economy. Again, I'm not trying to set up a straw man to dismiss economics. To be sure, other economic factors can be identified as candidates for these causes, such as changes in regulations and institutions that change the parameters of market exchange. But try as it might, economics as a discipline is limited in its explanatory method because of how it views the human agents that make economic decisions, seeing them fundamentally as rational utility maximizers who respond merely to material incentives and disincentives according to a cost-benefit calculus explained by rational choice theory. This in turn limits the possibilities it can offer for true and lasting reform, in my opinion, simply aiming at changing the incentive structures in the economy, such as regulatory or monetary or fiscal policy, in order to force economic agents into more social behavior, while leaving the agent as a person unchanged in the process, simply accepting his self-interestedness, his selfish nature as a given. This, however, is a rather reductionist view of the human person, because the reality is that man is more than just a bundle of self-interested preferences. He has a spiritual life that is just as real as his material dimension. And the spiritual dimension is in fact fundamental to who he is and how he acts. Now, lest you think that I'm jumping from economics to theology in one leap, I will get to theology eventually, don't worry. I'm just giving more time to get there. A knowledge of the spiritual side of man does not come from religion or revelation. Our knowledge of the spiritual side of man is grounded in reason and has been known by philosophers for hundreds of years before the advent of Christianity. The pagan philosopher Aristotle, for example, has left us one of the most brilliant expositions of the nature of the soul, purely from the standpoint of reason, unaided by revelation, his work, the De Anima. Now, I know that all of you study Western Civ and have probably read this work, which is one of the great classics of the Western intellectual tradition, so hopefully I don't need to go into too much detail about it. Indeed, I can't for sake of time. But what are the highlights? Well, first, Aristotle states that the soul is what distinguishes living things like plants, animals, and humans from non-living things like water, earth, air, fire. The soul being the principle of life, or to put it in his terms, the first grade of actuality of a natural body potentially having life in it. The soul is the form of living substances and makes it what it is, and thus there is a soul for plants, and a soul for animals, and a soul for human beings. The vegetative soul is what animates the activities of growth and self-nourishment in plants. And the animal soul is what brings about movement and sensation in animals. What distinguishes the human soul, however, from the souls of plants and animals is that the human soul has the powers of intellect and will. An intellect in order to know the truth, which it knows through immaterial concepts, and the power of will, which moves man to think intellect grasps as good. And these powers enable man to reflect and engage in free voluntary actions, rather than simply act on instinct or on impulse, or what Aristotle called the estimative power in animals. A man is a master of his actions. He can decide to do things or not do them as he pleases. But what is all this for? What is the purpose of life in nature? And what is the purpose of human life in particular? Aristotle believed that all things in nature act towards an end. This is a key principle, as you probably know, in Aristotelian philosophy, that is borne out by observation of the natural order. We can think of how plants act for the end of survival and growth in the way they spread their roots in order to find and absorb the nutrients they need to survive and grow. Animals also seek to survive and nourish themselves, but also to delight their senses and experience pleasure. And they use their senses in order to find food to nourish themselves and other goods to seek pleasure. The end that a thing has conditions how it acts. And so it is for human beings. Human beings also act for a particular end, and this dimension of human experience is studied by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. To cut to the quick, Aristotle states that man acts ultimately for the sake of happiness. That is, every human act is motivated by the desire for happiness, whether the person is conscious of it or not. You all here are in this lecture theatre ultimately for the sake of happiness, whether you were conscious of it or not. And if we had the time to track the various factors that led you to come here to this point, we would ultimately come to the conclusion that you're here to be happy. Now, Aristotle helpfully considers what constitutes happiness, And before he tells us the answer, he considers certain candidates for happiness that are not the true basis for happiness. The first is pleasure, that happiness consists in simply having pleasure. But Aristotle rules this out as tantamount to the life of beasts and animals. Pleasure may satisfy the senses, but not the higher powers of the human soul, like the intellect or the will. He also considers honor, which may be the end of political life or public life, but rules this out too, because honor is dependent on the regard that others give to you. It is not independent of others, nor simply based on a personal quality that you have. Thus, it can't be a reliable basis for happiness. Nor can wealth or making money be a basis for happiness, a third possibility that he also rules out, because wealth is something that is useful for the sake of other things, rather than something desirable for its own sake. It is a means to other ends, not an end in itself. The following quote from the Ethics is a good one to consider, given our topic today. The life of money-making is one undertaken under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else. And so one might rather take the aforenamed objects to be ends, for they are loved for themselves. But it is evident that not even these are ends, yet many arguments have been thrown away in support of them. For happiness to be true happiness, it must be something that is absolutely final, desired for its own sake, and be self-sufficient, not lacking in anything, nor requiring other things to meet its deficits. In his famous argument about the nature of happiness, Aristotle reasons that we can understand the proper happiness of a thing by first considering its characteristic activity. What is it that something does that marks it off from other things? In this case, what is it that marks a man from other things? Aristotle argues that man is a rational animal by definition, which means that man's characteristic is the activity of his soul that follows from his rationality. He is a being that can know and can will. He then asserts that to perform a function and to perform a function excellently are essentially the same thing, since to perform a function excellently is simply to perform the function, but in the most perfect way. That is, in a way such that the action can't be done better. The good for a particular being with a function is the performance or achievement of its function. A fruit tree that does not bear fruit is not good, because it is not performing its function. In the case of man, the human good is excellent activity of soul. And this excellent activity of soul, the powers of the soul operating in order to fulfill man's function, is what we call virtue. In order to understand this notion of virtue, Aristotle returns to his tripartite nature of the human soul we discussed before. There is even in the human soul a basic part which we call the nutritive and vegetative part, which moves the activities of nutrition and growth in the human body. This is a purely irrational part. The mind and the will are not engaged in the natural operations of the major organs of your body. So this part is not the subject of virtue, simply because it doesn't involve any rationality. The second part is what Aristotle calls the semi-rational part, which is the sensitive soul, which among its powers consists of the sensitive appetite, by which the body is moved semi-rationally towards sensible goods. This is a partly irrational part in that we are naturally attracted to the things that causes our senses to delight, and repulsed by things that cause our senses pain. But there is a certain rationality involved, because the sense appetite can be trained to a certain extent to shun things that our intellect knows are not good for us, or to delight in difficult things that are good for us. And this is the work of the moral virtues, which aim at the excellence of the sensitive part of the soul. And I'll explain a little bit more about the moral virtues in a moment. And finally, the third part of the human soul is the intellective part, in which is seated the intellect and will, our thinking and willing faculties, which we all have. This part of the soul is perfected in its function of thinking by the intellectual virtues, which again I'll explain in more detail in a moment. The moral virtues are habits that aim at the perfection of the sensitive part of the human soul, the part that enables man to move, and especially to feel or to sense. In particular, the moral virtues aim to subject the passions, those movements of the sensitive part of the soul, which are experienced as joy, sadness, fear, hope, sorrow, to subject them to the rule of reason, so that we feel pleasure and pain at the right things and in the right degree. And moral virtue is obtained by practice. It is not a part of our nature. A good example that I can give to illustrate moral virtue is my love for chocolate cake. Chocolate cake causes great pleasure to my sense of taste, and I certainly love my chocolate cake. Just the very sight of chocolate cake can get me excited. And to a certain degree, this is fine, and indeed normal. Who doesn't like chocolate cake after all? But if my appetite for chocolate cake is uncontrolled, then it can be harmful to me. Because if I allow myself to eat too much chocolate cake all the time, then I will become overweight, which in itself will cause other secondary issues that will affect my well-being. If I don't control myself in eating chocolate cake when I see it, then I will be enslaved to it and will not be able to resist eating it when I see it. In fact, if someone placed chocolate cake outside the door, I might run out of this room to go and get it. But if I do temper my consumption of chocolate cake, even though I love it, then I'm better able to protect all the other goods that are important to me, like my health and my fitness and my freedom and so on. This is, in fact, what Pope Pius XI is getting at in his Depression-era encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, when he identifies the root cause of the turmoil in economic and social life at the time as a disordering of the passions. Quote, "The root and font of this defection in economic and social life are the disordered passions of the soul, the sad result of original sin, which has so destroyed the wonderful harmony of man's faculties that, easily led astray by his evil desires, he is strongly incited to prefer the passing goods of this world to the lasting goods of heaven. Hence arises that unquenchable thirst for riches and temporal goods, which has at all times impelled men to break God's laws and trample upon the rights of their neighbours." What he is referring to here is the disordered passion for money, which leads people to work inordinately in order to accumulate wealth, as if that were the only good that he or she is made for. Spending too much time working or doing business, just like eating too much chocolate cake, can lead a person to think that his only happiness can be found in one material thing, money or chocolate cake, because it is not the real object of happiness, it can lead to harm towards other people, trampling on the rights of others to get a big slice of chocolate cake, or towards oneself, in denying oneself goods that will truly make one happy, like the lasting goods of heaven. In the life of virtue, there must be balance among the many different virtues that make up the excellence of the human soul. And chief among these will be the virtues that pertain to the highest goods, the lasting goods of heaven, what Aristotle calls the intellectual virtues. The intellectual virtues are virtues or habits that perfect the intellective part of the soul. And because they perfect the highest part of the soul, these virtues are involved in the highest happiness man can enjoy. This happiness, Aristotle argues, is the most excellent activity of the intellect, which occurs when the intellect thinks about the highest objects. This activity is called contemplation, and the highest object that is contemplated is God. This is the ultimate happiness in Aristotle's view, because 1, it is the most pleasant of activities, 2, it is self-sufficient, and 3, it is loved for its own sake. And what is most important for us to remember here is that what Aristotle says about how to obtain this happiness. Happiness depends on leisure, the retirement from business or work. The activity of contemplation makes for the complete happiness of man, so long as it is performed in a complete life. This means that a person's life must be balanced, involving an active life of work, but also time set apart for contemplation. This is the whole thrust of Pope Leo XIII's and Pius XI's encyclical letters. For Pius XI, the breakout of different crises was not so much a failure in government policy, but a symptom of the agnosticism which leads to an excessive devotion to material accumulation. Such commodity fetishism, in turn, leads to the corruption of morals, since the end for which man strives is no longer supernatural, but natural and unbalanced. A proper reorientation of man's outlook from material ends towards his true heavenly end, however, could not occur while modern man was engrossed in the world of work, as this would prevent him from turning his gaze heavenward. Hence the importance of regular spiritual retreats. To quote, "It is of the greatest importance that a man should withdraw himself from the bewitching of vanity which obscureth good things, and hide himself in that blessed secrecy where, cultured by heavenly teaching, he may form a just estimate and understand the value of human life devoted to the service of God alone. Thus will he learn to abhor the turpitude of sin, to conceive a holy fear of God, to see clearly unveiled the vanity of earthly things, and stirred up by the precepts and the example of him who is the way and the truth and the life, that he may put off the old man, may deny himself, and with humility, obedience, and voluntary chastisement of self, may put on Christ." What Pius XI envisaged in his encyclical was the regular practice of spiritual retreats, both longer retreats, approximately 4 times a year, and shorter retreats, such as every month, in order to ensure that the working faithful are able to transcend the mundane and contemplate their internal destiny through dedicated times of leisure from withdrawal from work. Yet while the recommendation of prayer may seem facile and simplistic in the face of a serious and complex problem such as the depression, his diagnosis of the spiritual roots of the problem was not his alone. In his book, The Acquisitive Society, first published in 1921, the Anglican theologian and economic historian Richard Tawney outlined the dangers inherent in a society that is not directed toward any higher end, but which allows individuals to maximize their own wealth through unfettered economic activity. According to Tawney, it is not theory that can resolve social and economic problems, but rather a reform of the moral principles underlying them. This is because social institutions are the visible expression of the scale of moral values which rule the minds of individuals, meaning in turn, the changes to the institutions that comprise the economy and society can only occur through a change in these principles. In agreement with the writings of the popes, Tawney further asserts that the problems of this time were due to an inordinate focus on productivity, exalting it as the sole criterion of social progress. Like Leo XIII, Tawney blamed this narrow focus on productivity on the alienation of the state and the church from the social conscience, which meant that neither society nor its institutions were any more influenced by the outward expression of the subordination of life to purposes transcending the personal private interests which they represented. In other words, the individualism and materialism which animated free market capitalism crowded out the moral conscience of society, the state and the church, and consequently led to the gradual disappearance from the social thought, the very idea of purpose itself. While Tawney's thesis was largely concerned with the recovery of the common good as a guiding concept for economic life, Tawney also recognized the importance of God to the realization of the common good and to the social fabric of a good community. To quote, "The conception of men as united to each other and of all mankind as united to God by mutual obligations arising from their relation to a common end ceased to be impressed upon men's mind when church and state withdrew from the center of social life to its circumference. Vaguely conceived and imperfectly realized, it had been the keystone holding together the social fabric." What Tawney is getting at here is the importance of religion to the regulation of social life, not just to individual life. St. Thomas Aquinas viewed religion not merely as a human activity, but as a virtue, and not as you might think as a theological virtue like faith, hope, and charity, that is to say, a virtue whose object is God, but rather a moral virtue which is directed at regulating man's actions in order to incline man to manifest to God the worship that is God's due as the creator of the world. Because religion is a moral virtue, it can be known through human reason. And indeed, a study of ancient cultures show that ancient cultures were highly religious cultures, well before the advent of God's revelation to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Religion, therefore, seeks to regulate man's actions in order to incline him to higher things, namely God. Religion involves external actions, such as worship and sacrifice, something that we all see in pagan cultures and, of course, the church. But it also involves interior actions, namely devotion, which involves meditation on God's goodness and loving kindness, which wakens love, and also on man's shortcomings, which enables a man to submit to God and to his commandments. And secondly, prayer, which is simply the act of asking becoming things of God. Like all moral virtues, it is through the regular practice of these actions, particularly the interior actions of devotion and prayer, that man can become more inclined habitually to higher things, and in turn, view material goods in their proper sapiential perspective, as things that are subordinate to the higher things that give man true and everlasting happiness. A life of religion is not just meant to be lived by religious, because all human beings are created for human happiness. In his famous encyclical about the plight of the working class in the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII decried the unjust treatment of workers and was not oblivious at the same time to the fundamental spiritual crisis that undergirded their plight, stressing, as the popes do, the importance of spiritual renewal through a better practice of religion. It is clear that they, meaning Christian nations, must pay special and chief attention to the duties of religion and morality, and that social betterment should have this chiefly in view. Otherwise, they would lose wholly their spiritual character and end by becoming little better than those societies which take no account whatever of religion. What advantage can it be to a working man to obtain by means of a society material well-being if he endangers his soul for lack of spiritual food? In Rerum Novarum, this spiritual food was to be found in the keeping of Sundays and holy days of obligation and frequenting the sacraments. Quote, since these are the means ordained by God for obtaining the forgiveness of sins and for leading a holy life. But he did not stop there. To help provide spiritual food for the working man and for all, Leo XIII wrote another encyclical letter the year after the release of Rerum Novarum. Laetitiae Sanctae, on the Holy Rosary and the social question, was one of 9 encyclicals that Leo XIII wrote about the Holy Rosary. But what was distinctive about this encyclical was its discussion of how the Rosary could be applied to address very specific social problems which Leo XIII had identified in numerous other social encyclicals. For Leo XIII, the Rosary was not simply a tool of personal piety. To this end, Leo XIII first cites 3 adverse attitudes that have caused what he calls the signal decline in the society of his time. First, the distaste for a simple and laborious life. Secondly, repugnance to suffering of any kind. And thirdly, the forgetfulness of the future life. And then he links each of these problems with the joyful, sorrowful, and glorious mysteries, respectively, in order to illustrate how each set of mysteries can serve as remedies to these ills. In the first case, the disdain for a simple life, Leo XIII focuses on how the joyful mysteries can address the various manifestations flowing on from this attitude. He enumerates a number of its effects: the readiness of children to withdraw themselves from the natural obligation of obedience to their parents, which he blames for rising class warfare and revolutionary attitudes against the public order. The joyful mysteries, however, bring home to mind the chief virtues of life by meditation on the home of Nazareth. Quote, how much have we to learn from the daily life which was led within its walls? What an all-perfect model of domestic society. Here we behold the simplicity and purity of conduct, perfect agreement and unbroken harmony, mutual respect and love, not of the false and fleeting kind, but that which finds both its life and its charm in devotedness of service. We find there that supreme peace of mind and gladness of soul which never fail to accompany the possession of a tranquil conscience. These are precious examples of goodness, of modesty, of humility, of hard-working endurance, of kindness to others, of diligence in the small duties of daily life, and of other virtues. And once they have made their influence felt, they gradually take root in the soul, and in the course of time fail not to bring about a happy change of mind and conduct. The sorrowful mysteries, about the death of Christ, address the second pernicious attitude, the fear of suffering, which takes away the peace and reward of those who would exhibit fortitude, leading people to seek a life of unbridled pleasure. Meditating on the suffering and death of Christ remedies this malaise by setting a standard for imitation and providing meaning for suffering. Quote, witnessing these examples of fortitude by Christ, not with sight but by faith, who is there who will not feel his heart grow warm with the desire of imitating them? The glorious mysteries address the chief characteristics of the times in which we live, the forgetfulness of the future life, which leads to a sinful attachment to the things of earth and even a contempt for the things of heaven. Leo XIII sees in the glorious mysteries the crowning remedy to all three modern attitudes, since it contains the promise of great glory for those who live a simple life, the promise of peace and healing for those who must face suffering and death, and the promise of unspeakable treasures in heaven for those who love God. Meditating on these sublime things helps to put man's earthly existence in its proper perspective and to gain wisdom in properly valuing natural versus supernatural goods. Dwelling upon such a prospect, our hearts are kindled with desire, and we exclaim in the words of a great saint, "How vile grows the earth when I look up to heaven." Then too shall we feel the solace of the assurance that which is at the present momentary time, a light of our tribulation worketh for us above measure exceedingly an eternal weight of glory. As we have seen in this talk, prayer was a key plank in the vision of social and economic reform shared by Popes Leo XIII and Pius XI. Theirs was a radical vision, shared by fewer and heeded by fewer still, as our modern society has plunged deeper in its obsession with pursuing wealth. Yet their call was not unreasonable and was rooted in a proper understanding about the nature of the human person as not simply a material entity, but a union of soul and body created for a happiness far greater than anything that this world can provide. And yet I ponder with great sadness of even how in my own lifetime I have witnessed the wrong direction that my own native Australia took in the mid-1990s when our strict Sunday trading laws, which prevented businesses from opening for trade on Sundays, were repealed to allow businesses to trade, forcing workers into a 7-day working week and removing the one guarantee the families had of being together on at least one certain day of the week, not to mention the opportunity to give time to God at church and in restful personal prayer. I can only pray, as I'm sure the popes did those years ago, for the economic and social reform that can only come from the spiritual renewal they perceived as necessary for peace and true progress. And so I conclude my talk with the wise and hopeful words of Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical on the Holy Rosary, which sums it all up. Here alone in prayer, we discovered the true relation between time and eternity, between our life on earth and our life in heaven. And it is thus alone that are formed strong and noble character. When such characters can be counted in large numbers, the dignity and well-being of society are assured. All that is beautiful, good, and true will flourish in the measure of its conformity to Him, who is of all beauty, goodness, and truth, the first principle and the last end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, brother, for your wonderful talk and being able to synthesize all this together. We do have some time for question and answers. And so maybe if we could start, if there's a student who has a question first, we'll pass the mic around, that way the camera can pick up the audio as well. So is there a question?
There's a question over there.
Right here. Great.
What led you to kind of discover and look more into this parallelism of the people who were feeling this oppression in this time period, and then what kind of was your motivation to connect it back to your religious beliefs?
Yeah. So there is a bit of a story behind this. Father Peter Martyr mentioned when I was a postdoc at Oxford, one of my responsibilities was to organize a fortnightly series on the history of financial crises. And so because it was Oxford. We were able to draw all sorts of prominent experts on different financial crises over time. So I think the first person looked at the railroad boom in the UK in the 1840s, and we looked at various financial crises in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And the task was for them to outline, firstly, what were the causes of this particular crisis, what happened in the crisis, and finally, what solutions did government provide to these crises. And when I formed this view of coming up with this fortnightly series, what I was thinking as an economist was, okay, so what matrix, what set of monetary and fiscal policies ensure that financial crises don't occur or mitigate the risk of financial crises? And what I found, sitting through this for a whole year, was that there isn't really a set of monetary and fiscal of regulation that can prevent financial crises, because there's always some way, there's always some loophole that businesses, particularly financiers, will find to rot the system and to create the kinds of bubbles that eventually lead to busts and then economic crises. So at around that same time, I was reading this social encyclical literature, and I was quite taken aback by how the popes responded to this particular crisis, which is very different to what I, as an economist, had been trained to think about financial crises, how to analyze them, and think about potential solutions. That here they were quite boldly talking about the need for a spiritual renewal, diagnosing the problem as essentially a spiritual one, having a disordered notion of what actually constitutes human happiness. And I think that is actually, in the end, a much more wise and sensible explanation for what's going on, rather than to simply analyze things through the prism of neoclassical economics, looking at incentive structures, which then limits you to then regulatory responses that aim at trying to change incentives to more socially responsible behavior. And so that's a kind of a long history of how I came to this idea.
Thank you. Question in the back.
I might not need a microphone, so it's...
Yeah, I can...
You guys all hear me?
So, it's for the recording, to be honest, yes.
No worries. So, I think the causality I typically see is that through the boom-bust cycle, usually people begin to pray when the recessions start to begin, but it seems like you're saying that there might be some room for some policies in the beginning to be a little bit more lined up with sort of the ethics that we have set aside. But you did bring up the housing crisis, and I'm going to nudge you a little bit and say that we've had bubbles in the past that didn't necessarily require a low interest rate environment. The .com you mentioned was one of them. I am of the school that I think a lot of the causes of the housing crisis were perhaps not brought about by ills, but brought about by many of our elected officials wanting home ownership as a way of bridging the upper class with some of the lower classes. It was a bipartisan issue. Republicans like private property, obviously, and Democrats wanted this as a vehicle for bringing some of the impoverished up into higher classes better. So with that being said, a policy such as that meant, I think, with some good intention to a bubble, see future policies being, I guess, perhaps more engineered with macroprudentialness in mind without sacrificing some of the motivations I think you brought to light here in your speech.
So firstly, the theory that I presented, the narrative for the recent financial crisis, was not my theory. That was a theory that was presented at Oxford. So those two major causes, that of the low interest rates and the CDOs, were really quite secondary effects, as I alluded to in my talk. These are not primary causes of the financial crisis. And of course, there are other factors government policies to expand the rate of home ownership, for example, is one. We could also look at financial deregulation, which I think is another big factor, basically allowing banks to increase their mortgage assets ad infinitum without any concern for macroprudential stability. The way I see things going forward is obviously there's a role for governments to regulate markets, okay? But the problem with, I think that, laissez-faire economics, this, extreme view of market liberalism is grounded in a view that really the end of human existence is material accumulation, and so you need to remove all obstacles that enable the individual to maximize wealth. Whereas if you have a much broader vision of what constitutes human flourishing, then you have a basis for governments and policy decision makers to say, well, financial growth or economic growth is not the only factor that we need to look at. We also need to look at things like the stability of the financial system, equitable distribution of wealth, economic growth that involves job creation, and these kinds of other considerations. So I think that you have to have a much broader vision, a moral vision of the human person and what constitutes human happiness in order to have a better view of what sets of policies and what sets of policy targets you want to have as a government.
Thank you. On the back here.
See who wins.
It's a race. This is maybe an unfair question, and I am no theologian. I am also an economist by training, but it's my understanding that in the foundational texts of most of the world's religions, one can find the contention that all markets, not just financial markets and business that partakes in those markets, must be grounded in or constrained by a society and ethics, if you will. And I wonder if that is something you've done any reading about, and whether you might recommend to those here some reading about that.
Okay, well, you mentioned world religions, so there is an Islamic Economics, for example, that's actually quite well developed. I'm not read in that particular area, but I do know that it exists. In terms of Catholicism, I think there are lots of great writers that talk about the importance of ethics to regulating the market economy, and I myself particularly like the distributists. So people like G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc are very good in terms of outlining a vision of the economy that's grounded in the values of the gospel. But there are other research areas, other economists, Catholic economists, working on how to incorporate ethics into economics. I know there's a book by Peter Rona, Economics as a Moral Science, which gives a great survey of some of the new work that's being done to update neoclassical, well, possibly even replace neoclassical theory with sociological theories that take into account relationality rather than just seeing economic decisions or economic agents as responding to material incentives, to analyze economic activity in terms of relations between people that allows the incorporation of virtue ethics into the economic analysis. So Peter Rona's book, Economics as a Moral Science, I think is a recent publication that covers that quite well. R-O-N-A, Peter.
We have one in the back.
Hi, my name is Holly Taylor Kuhlman. I teach here in the theology department. So it seems to me that your lecture today raises an enormous question, which really is going to appear in many other settings. So I apologize because I'm about to ask you a big question. But it goes like this. It seems to me that practically speaking, the elephant in the room in response to this talk is what looks like the fact on the ground, at least at the present moment, it looks like it, that the more developed the culture in which we live, the more rapidly and profoundly secularized that culture is. We know that that's not true, of course, in many cultures across the globe, but it certainly is in the cultures where the most important and most influential markets are operating. So really, I'm asking something that goes beyond the scope of your talk, which is, what are your best guesses about the strategies that can be pursued? Let's just say that we're just gonna say for argument's sake that I buy your talk hook, line, and sinker, but 96 or so % of my colleagues, as I head off into to work, in markets, don't buy it. And let me just offer one additional thought about that. It seems to me that in a increasingly radically secularized context, Thomistic thought does have an advantage, which is this: the category of natural law does give you possibilities to try to do ad hoc, collaborations, wherever you can do them, on naming and pursuing the good, right? But as you know, I think probably there are many people now who are pretty pessimistic about hopes for collaboration, and they are, they want to take the Benedict option or something else. They want to. Sorry?
Do you mean interdisciplinary collaboration? So collaboration.
I don't. I'm heading off, and I am going to do my work. Just imagine a million different possibilities in business, management, finance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm heading into a world in which the majority of people with whom I work closely will not agree with me that prayer is helpful. Let me just say, what they're going to hold is a neoliberal view that there is absolutely no reason to inject any account of the good at all. That's the dominant view. And if I want to inject it, what I'm doing is a very unfortunate category mistake. I don't grasp that the good has no place in the business world. What do I do? How do I, build? How do I work together? Or the question is, do I not work together with those people? Do I look to build little coalitions with other, very small groups or whatever?
Yeah,
Okay, sorry.
So in suggesting all this, I think that one has to draw a distinction between knowing the truth and then thinking about whether applying that truth is feasible given the current circumstances. So what I think that I've done today is try to outline some truth, the truth about the human person and what that implies in terms of how governments, and indeed the church in cooperation with governments, can try to address the human and moral problems that lead to the kind of excessive behavior that causes financial crises. So we shouldn't be put off by bringing economics and theology into conversation if indeed we're going to obtain some truth in that. As for, how do we make this popularly known? How do we implement these kinds of ideas at a macro level? I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's really hard because we are living in a society that's highly secularized, which just rejects offhand the idea that there is a God. And this is kind of why I entered the order of preachers, was to try to evangelize that world a little bit at a time. So I do think at the same time that a significant change to the economy isn't really going to occur until you get an economic meltdown. And that's one thing that, one lesson that we learned from economic history, and that's something that came out from our fortnightly series on economic histories, is that regulatory responses to the kinds of economic behavior that cause crises don't happen until the financial crisis unfolds. And then there's a certain level of introspection and an openness to other ideas. Can the ideas that I've espoused today ever become part of the mainstream? I don't know. But I do think that there's a truth in it. And I think that it is something that's worth the research program of academic economists and theologians.
I think we have time for one more.
Thank you. Your argument seems, I think, there seems to be two. Well, the second part where you talk about the need for prayer and contemplation for a fully human life is one point, but then the implication, what I take away from your talk is that if we had that, if we focused more on that as a society, then our economic house would be put in order. But that doesn't seem to, even just thinking about that and not being an economist, I don't have any arguments, I don't have any way to argue that that's not plausible, but it just seems, if you think about engineering or if you think about any really complicated system, the people designing the system, the people operating the system could be as virtuous as you like, but the system itself, just considering the nature of complexity, is still going to be vulnerable and it might be maybe more resilient, but that doesn't mean that it can't collapse. That doesn't mean that there can't be problems. So, and I think what you offer more than anything is, you make it it seems to me, this is a criticism, that the second part is too dependent on the first. And I think the second part would be true even if, for example, if we were virtuous, the economy collapsed. I think that what you show is that we would be better prepared, we'd be better able to weather those storms, which I think are inevitable, if we concentrated more on the spiritual dimension. Because I wonder, can a capitalist system avoid these cycles, or is it inevitable if it's just part of the system? It doesn't matter how virtuous we are, it doesn't matter how it's going to happen.
Yeah. So I said that I was a fan of Hyman Minsky's economic theory, and I think that's right. There is something that is inherently unstable about capitalist economies, and economic history just bears that out. You can't dispute the facts. I would say that a spiritual renewal of society is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for bringing about economic stability. If there isn't a spiritual renewal and we still have this problem of more and more people consuming their lives to accumulate wealth, there's definitely going to be a continuation and a recurrence of problems. If we are able, just hypothetically, to bring about a spiritual renewal such that people have a much more balanced life and ideally even live a life of contemplation and prayer, I don't think that that's sufficient to be able to prevent economic crises, because the economic realities are real and they have an effect. So if you have holy people but with a defective economic system, of course there's going to be problems. This is why I'm not discounting economics as a body of knowledge. Economics is very important. I mean, I have a doctorate in it. I wouldn't have spent time studying economics if I thought it was useless. It is important to understand the economic causes of economic crises, and to have both an historical and a theoretical understanding of how to deal with financial crises. So that, combined with a virtuous society, we can design and we can, move towards a better designed economy that's more stable and that's more conducive to human flourishing. Does that satisfy your question?
Great, thank you very much.
Okay.
If you have any other questions or would like to follow up, there's a reception out in the atrium, so please join us. There's food, and we can continue the conversation.